Afternoon, everybody. I am Palak Singla, and today I would be giving my presentation on the article Informed Consent, written by Tom L. Buchanan. And the topic that I would be covering for the presentation would be the concept of informed consent and the current challenges in informed consent. So to begin with, I would like to start with the term autonomy, which we discussed in just the previous class of bioethics. So autonomy is a term which is derived from two Greek words, autos and nomos, which means self and law respectively. Now, autonomy is a core principle in contemporary medicine, and it has been adopted in reference to concepts such as informed consent and decision making. Now, medicine as a field prioritizes the patient autonomy, and they deem that it is ethically and morally necessary for the patient to have the power to make all the medical decisions that is affecting them. So now we look at what is informed consent. So, informed consent is the process by which the treating healthcare provider needs to disclose the appropriate amount of information to a competent patient so that the patient may have the voluntary choice to either accept or reject any particular line of treatment that has been suggested for them. Now, the concept of informed consent originates from the concept that it is a legal and ethical right of the patient to direct what happens to their body, and it is also the ethical duty of the physician to involve the patient in their own healthcare. Now, I would like to tell about some of the elements that are involved in the full informed consent. Now, we've already looked at how the most important goal of informed consent is that the patient must have the opportunity to be an informed participant in their own healthcare decisions. Now, it is generally accepted that informed consent includes the discussions of the following elements. So, I would now list few elements. The first is the very nature of the decision or the procedure that needs to be held. Then comes the reasonable alternatives to the proposed intervention that the physician or the doctor might suggest. Then comes the relevant risks or the benefits or the uncertainties which are related to this very alternative. Then comes the element of the assessment of the patient understanding, that how well has the patient actually understood the medical procedure that has to be attempted on the patient. And the last is the final element, which is the acceptance of the intervention by the patient. Now we would look into detail into the concept of informed consent. Now, before we can legitimately infer that what exactly informed consent is, we need to know that what we are looking for. So, if one uses a very overly demanding criteria of informed consent, such as the full disclosure or the complete understanding, then this kind of understanding of informed consent is basically difficult to obtain. Conversely, if we take an under-demanding criteria for informed consent, such as just to use a consent form, now this is something which is very easy to obtain, but this term does is that it loses the moral significance of the very concept of informed consent. So the question now is that what exactly is informed consent? Now this becomes a complicated question because there have been two irreducibly different meanings of informed consent that have been existed in the history. Now we look at both of them. Now, in the first sense, informed consent is an autonomous authorization by the individual patient or subject. Now, in this, a person gives an informed consent in a sense that they have a substantial understanding and about the medical procedure that has to be undertaken, and the decision to either accept or reject the procedure is dependent solely on the patient and is devoid of any external control or pressure. Now, in the second sense, informed consent is analyzable. Now, it is analyzable in the terms of institutional and policy rules of consent that collectively form the social practice of informed consent. So, here, this informed consent is basically relative to the social and institutional context and need not be truly autonomous authorization. So, however, the literature in bioethics has increasingly maintained that any justifiable analysis of informed consent must be rooted in autonomous rules, because that is the very essence of bioethics, that the informed consent should be solely just a decision that is based on the patient and should not be relative to any other social or institutional concept, institutional authority. So now we look at that, is it ever acceptable to not have a fully informed consent? So there are a few exceptions in which the informed consent can be waived. So the first exception can be that if the patient does not have a decision making capacity. For example, the patient has dementia. So in that case, there would be a requirement of a proxy or a surrogate decision maker who could take a decision on behalf of the patient. There might be another case in which the patient is waiving the consent voluntarily. In that case, the consent can be waived off. Then there can be another case in which the patient is unconscious and the situation requires an immediate decision. So the patient is unconscious, so they cannot make a decision, whereas any surrogate decision maker is not available at the moment. In that case, as well, the informed can be waived. And there is a last condition when the informed consent can be waived. That is when the competent patient themselves voluntarily voluntarily designate a trusted loved one to make the decision on their behalf. So generally in our culture, this trusted loved one is generally a family member. So now we will look at the current challenges that pertain in informed consent. So the first challenge is the limits of the law in the biomedical ethics. Now we all know that the law must govern the understanding of informed consent. But the problem is that the law is ill-equipped to help us in our thinking about informed consent, and it is only restricted in the limits in which the law operates. So these limits have misled a lot of doctors and has misled them about their responsibilities to their patients and subjects. So the legal standards are of not of major assistance in formulating the conception of informed consent, because the legal standards look more towards the appropriate model of what is illegal rather than focusing on what is ethical or unethical. Now, but we all know, since we are studying the paper of bioethics, the main focus of philosophy here is in informed consent is on ethics. So basically, the heart of the issue about informed consent is moral and it is not legal. The next challenge is the quality of consent. Now, the problems about the quality and adequacy of consent cannot be resolved unless the conventional disclosure rules are refocused. So, we need to refocus the quality on the basis of not just the understanding of the consent in a patient, but as well as we need to look at the rights of the patient and their needs of information. So, this approach centers attention on the need for effective communication and understanding on the part of patients and subjects. Now, the challenge here is that it is not clear that how much progress has been made in the last 20 years relating to this genuine communication and understanding between a medical between the physician or a doctor or a patient. The next challenge we look into is the regulation of content and of consent and the research distinction. So there is a basic distinction in bioethics, that is between the clinical research and the medical practice. So research is basically a systematic intervention and the study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and to reach the conclusions. And so basically, this distinction between medical practice and medical practice and clinical research has dominated the biomedical ethics, including informed consent. So there has been a widespread belief regarding there has been a widespread belief regarding the clinical research that in clinical researches the patient's rights are violated, and there has been assumption that clinical research involve they are dangerous and they basically exist just for the benefit of future patients, and they're extremely based on scientific knowledge, but they do not benefit the current patients. So that is why patients are a bit aversive towards medical research. So there has been this huge dilemma and there has been this huge conflict as to which should be given more importance. Like should the medical research should be given more important, or the medical research or the medical practice. So this has been a major topic of conflict which has arisen in informed consent. So to conclude my presentation, so basically consent is to truly permit a patient to decisively communicate their perspectives and for the patient to have a comprehensive understanding of both their current conditions and knowledge and the consequences of each of the options. So, in theory, all the practicing physicians should be ensuring that the informed consent is acquired from a patient prior to any procedure. But, however, this is not always the case because there are certain systematic barriers in place that do inhibit the understanding of the patient. So the history of informed consent is still unfolding, and there are current failures that may be no less apparent to the future generations than have been the past and that have been the failures in the past. So clearly, we do face certain unresolved and critical moral challenges when it comes to the concept of informed consent in bioethics. And to finally conclude, I would just like to quote Bob McDonald, who said that informed consent is required in every invasive medical procedure, starting from getting your ears pierced to having an abortion. So that is where my presentation ends. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, my name is Tanya and I'll be giving my presentation on the topic informed consent. And this article is written by Tom L. Buchan. So I'll be covering three subtopics which the Buchan covered. First, historical development in very brief. Then I'll be explaining what is the concept of informed consent. And then I'll discuss three challenges, which I found very important. I hope you'll understand too. Okay, so starting from historical development. So Buchan mentioned that about three classical documents on medicines, such as Hippocrates' writing and Thomas Percival's medical ethics. And what he tried to show that these all writings that were written on in those times had a very disappointing history of the perspective of right to informed consent. And the very major problem with all these writings was how to avoid making disclosures that could harm or upset a patient. What used to happen was times the doctrine of informed consent was basically imposed through non-medical authorities. Now, what I mean by non-medical authorities is through courts, judges, government officials. So these were the non-medical authorities through whom this doctrine of informed consent used to regulate. Now coming to 1950s and 1960s. So during 1950s and 60s, the duty to obtain consent in few fields like surgery evolved through courts, as I just said. And hence this word informed got tagged with it. So basically, because these consent were regulated through legal authorities, which consisted of courts, police, judges. So it became from consent to informed consent. And there were many other decisions that were made into laws that got added into these uh, this doctrine, this particular doctrine of informed consent. So, if I mention certain case, there was a landmark case that author wrote about. It was a case of Salgo versus Leyland Stanford Junior University in 1957, and this particular case contributed to many several decisions that were taken and were made into laws eh, and added to the doctrine of informed consent. Then there was again in 1972, three most important decisions were taken in the three separate courts of USA, which solidified this right to informed consent and also advanced the prominence of the same. Now, from there onwards, what happened was numerous articles came to be published in the medical literature about the informed consent. And this very term, this doctrine, became very, very famous. There was this case that author Bucham mentioned. It happened in 1960. There was a study basically done by a lawyer surgeon team, and it was done and it suggested basically the prominence of consent forms. So it suggested that the consent forms were not very prominent even in the fields like surgery, where the important decisions are taken by the patient now, but it wasn't that prominent in 1960s. But there was a rapid change seen in 1970 to 78. So what happened was there was this solidification of the view that both physicians and medical practitioners have this legal or moral duty to take consent before any kind of procedure that they're going to do on a patient. So this was the most important thing that happened. And from there onwards, Buchamp wrote that several surveys were also conducted. Various surveys were conducted, one being the survey done by Louis Harris and Associates of US Prison Commission in 1982, which suggested basically that all the surveys that were conducted by Louis Harris and the Associates indicated that the decisions that were taken, all the decisions that were taken under that survey was with the permission, with the consent of the patients. And this was a very, very important thing that happened in 1980s because these surveys had a very powerful impact on the doctrine of informed consent from 1980s onwards. So these surveys and all those studies that were conducted played a very important role in deciding several laws and adding to the decisions in the informed consent. Now, coming to what is the concept of informed consent? What does Buchamp wrote about informed consent? How he explained informed consent? So basically, he wrote that there are two common, entrenched, and irreducibly different meanings of informed consent. So he basically explained it in two sense. So in first sense, he said that informed consent is an autonomous authorization by an individual, patient, or subject that everybody is telling over here. So this was his first sense. So now what does it mean by autonomous authorization? I'll explain. So a person gives a consent with substantial understanding and the absence of control of others, and intentionally authorizes a health professional to do something. So this is the first sense he talked about. So here are two keywords which needs to be remembered: substantial understanding and absence of control of others. There should not be any kind of a pressure by any third party or any other member, and a person in full conscious should understand, have the understanding of the procedure that he will be going through. So this was the first sense he talked about. Now coming to the second sense. So what does it mean according to Buchamp? The meaning of informed consent in second sense. So informed consent in the second sense refers to the only to legally or institutionally effective approval by an individual, subject, or a patient. Now, what does it mean institutionally or legally? I'm explaining. So, according to him, approval is only effective or valid if it confirms the conforms the rules or regulations that are governed by a specific organization that a patient or an individual is related to. If you are legally binded to an organization or you belong to the institution, to that particular institution. So your informed consent is only effective if it confirms all the regulations that is binding your institution. So this is what he meant the meaning of informed consent in second sense. Legally and institutionally binding the approval, basically, effective approval. So this was the meaning of informed consent in second sense, according to him. I hope it's clear. Now coming to the challenges. Challenges, he talked about four challenges, but we will only be going to covering three challenges. So the first challenge that Buchamp talked about in his article was the quality of consent. Now, here also we have two keywords. One keyword is genuine understanding, and the second keyword is effective communication. So, what Buchamp wrote is the quality of consent centers its attention on the need for effective communication and genuine understanding of patient or subject. So, if the communication is not proper, if uh, if the patient or a subject is unclear about the procedure, about the research study, then it is very obvious that the quality of consent is very weak. So this poses a very challenge to informed consent according to the author. Hence, he wrote that effective communication, two-way communication should be there, and also the genuine understanding, adequate understanding of the things, of the procedure, and everything that a patient or a subject is will be going through in the whole process of surgery or any medical treatment or any research study. So this is one challenge, the quality of consent to informed consent according to author Tom L. Bucha. Now coming to the second challenge. Uh, so the second problem according to Bucha was the problem of broad consent. Now this is a topic of concern in both, specifically in both Europe and US. This is what author wrote. And specifically, US bioethics views that a consent should be an adequately informed consent, and broad consent is not adequate. Now, let me tell you what is broad consent. So, author explains the broad consent through his own example. He wrote about a case of Havasupai Indians and the diabetes research. So, according to that research, what that case involved was uh, there was a research study basically done in by the Arizona State University, and the subjects were taken as Havasupai Indians. Havasupai Indians are the tribal people that live in Grand Canyon, and the matter did not go well because of broad consent. So what happened was that the members of fast disappearing Havasupai tribes gave their DNA samples. So for the research, they gave their DNA samples to the State University, Arizona State University. And okay, so goal was to study the genetic information about the tribe race. They wanted to know how about the diabetes, about their genetic problem, which is basically the diabetes, and why they are becoming extinct day by day, why people are leaving. So, what was the problem was these people, Havasupai Indians, had a high incidence of type 2 diabetes. So this led to amputation, obviously, and many people from the tribe left the village for dialysis. So uh, during the study, the tribe's diabetes was examined. They got to know that their diabetes is very high, and they had to manage it somehow. But what exactly happened was the DNA sample, the blood sample that they gave, was put to another uses as well. So they were put to several study uses in several. So one of the study was on mental illness, in which their blood samples was used. Then another study was to understand their geographical origin. So these were some studies in which the DNA samples were put to use. And obviously, some of these studies were later judged by Havasupai tribes, and they found it very provocative, insulting, and offending. For example, there was one of the study which was done on through their DNA sample, which indicated a high degree of inbreeding in the tribe. So they found it, sorry, very insulting and offending at the same time. But what happened was a geneticist who was responsible for most of these research. She defended her action. She defended her action as late as 2009, and she suggested that she took an adequate informed consent, and hence the research studies and everything that they did is ethically justified. Was the use of broad consent. So what happened was 100 members from the tribe, around 100 members of the tribe signed this broad consent, which said that the study that these DNA samples that they are using put will be put to use only to the studies which involve behavioral and medical disorders. So in that paper they signed, but what happened was the tribe members adamantly denied they had given the permission to use their DNA sample any of this non-diabetic research. And also they said that they were not given a proper understanding and adequate understanding of the risk involving these research study and what all other research will be taking place with their own DNA samples. So they obviously denied. Hence, this case was one that author wrote, and it actually presents a paradigmatic problem of human right and informed consent. And it is a challenge to informed consent in real term. I hope it's clear. Now, coming to the third challenge. The third challenge that the author wrote about is the regulation of consent and the research treatment distinction. Now, what is meant by the regulation of consent and research treatment distinction? So, according to this challenge, it basically deals with how should we alter the ways in which consent is regulated. So, what author wrote, according to him, in 1970s, an assumption arose that any research that involved human beings is very dangerous, and it exists only for the benefits of human rights and future generation, and is aimed at scientific knowledge and not for the benefits of an immediate subject. So later it was concluded that need for consent is more important in research studies than in medical practice. So what happened is this assumption grew, and after this assumption grew, the patients, even today, the patients that we see in hospitals and in other medical areas, they are underprotected, and research subjects got overprotected. Have more rights, they are more informed in their studies than our patients. They have a serious threat to life because they are not given that sufficient understanding of their procedure, their medical treatment. And hence, this has become a challenge, a real challenge to current consent practices. So basically, this challenge now poses two central questions. So whether first question is basically whether we have a moral system in which there should be an intense, ethical, close review of consent forms in research, but no attention should be paid to medical practice. So this is what happening. This is what is happening. There are no close attention paid to consent forms that are available in medical treatment. But uh, at the handwritten, the Google forms that we see for research studies that are done in different fields, not just in biology, different kinds of science, physics, even in psychology. They are put to various kinds of analyzation, different interpretation, but it is not done for the consent forms that are available in hospitals. So this was the central question. So why are we avoiding that? And the second question was whether we should have a government regulatory system in which we have a close ethical review again for the research, but no attention paid to medical practice. Now also, government, even there are associations that are formed in different fields. I'm from psychology, so I can tell there is American Association for Psychology, which has guidance with which provides an ethical consideration in for the research that is done in psychology, basically. But if we look at ICMR, people are not that much aware of whatever there is in those consent forms of whatever the ethical decisions that are taken. They are not aware, and hence they kind of they remain unaware throughout their lives, even when they go out of they step out of the hospitals. Their treatment has been done, but they still remain very puzzled. What happened, what was the procedure, how it happened. So this poses the question to the regulation of consent and the research treatment distinction. We should according to this challenge particularly, we should have a moral system where equal heed and attention should be paid to both research studies as well as medical practice. So it should be same for all the researchers and the physician, medical practitioners, etc. Uh, Hence, in the end, I would only like to say that the history of informed consent is still unfolding, and the current failures may be no less apparent to our future generation, and the failures that have been encountered by us in the past and present. But I think what author also discusses in the article and what I also feel is that we should not too condemnably, too sternly basically condemn all the judgments and the practices that are taking place. We should have faith in moral system and spread awareness ourselves, because these are the two things that can lead to advancement and betterment in the ethical consideration in the whole section area or of ethical consideration, not just informed consent. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Today I'll be speaking on the topic current challenges to informed consent from the article named Informed Consent, written by Tom L. Bouchamp. Now, before starting with the challenges, let us first understand what is consent. What does consent actually mean? So, Beauchamp and Faden defined consent as an autonomous authorization of medical interventions by individual patients. The term consent implies to the acceptance of a particular suggested intervention or suggested treatment. However, the concept of consent can also be applied to the choice of a patient in selecting between alternative treatments, and also the choice of the patient to reject a particular suggested treatment. Now, the concept of consent, it has three major components, namely disclosure, capacity, and voluntariness. So, disclosure refers to the communication of the correct information by a clinician and also the comprehension of the information by the patient. Capacity refers to the ability of the patient to comprehend and understand the information given by the clinician, and also their ability to appreciate the consequences of their decision. And voluntariness, it refers to the free decision of a patient to either reject or select between alternative treatments without any force or manipulation. Now, let us move to types of consent. So, there are majorly two types of consent. One can be explicit consent or implicit. The explicit consent can be given written or orally to a doctor or clinician, and the consent is implied when the willingness of a patient to do a particular procedure is indicated by their behavior. Now, another very important form of consent is informed consent, about which Busham talks about, in his article. So, there are two fairly common and well established, irreducibly different definitions of informed consent. So, in one sense, it is the autonomous authorization by an individual patient. So, here it is in the context of autonomy and self determining choice. In the second sense, it is, we can understand informed consent in a way of institutional or policy rules of consent. So here it is just the consent, it only refers to a legally binding or institutional rules which can be given by a patient. However, the author believes that the former definition, that is consent relating to autonomy, is more ethically and morally correct definition of informed consent. So, after understanding what consent and informed consent really means, let us put our attention to the challenges we face today in the theory and practice of informed consent. So, this heading, the author divides it into four major basic headings. The first one is the limits of law in biomedical ethics. So here, the problem is that how do we understand the way in which law shapes our understanding of informed consent? Now, the doctrine of informed consent is a legal doctrine, and it is generally used, both of them are used synonymously. However, the problem with that is that the legal doctrine is focused more on the rules of disclosure and the liability to injury, and which is very basic and very narrow concept and categorization for thinking about both patients and subjects in a research. And the author also think that law is very ill-equipped in helping our understanding of informed consent beyond the limits in which the law works. Now, Jay Katz, an American legal scholar and a psychiatrist, also think that the legal declarations are very optimistic and are morally empty. So, therefore, we can say that legal standards are not enough to cater to our formulation of the concept of informed consent, because they're more concerned about what is illegal rather than unethical treatment. And the issue with bioethics and informed consent is more moral rather than legal. Now, the next challenge which Bouchard talks about is the challenge of quality and advocacy of the informed consent. Now, this problem can be solved if it can be only solved unless the conventional disclosure rules focus more towards the need for information of people and protecting the rights of people, and also the quality of consent which is given. Now, this approach draws our attention to the need of effective communication and genuine understanding by the patient of the procedure or of the research in case of subjects. And without very proper climate of the exchange of information, the generally the wants of the patients are silenced. And in the past 20 years, there is not much research going on in this area of the quality of consent, and this is a problem which we face even today. The next challenge about informed consent is the problem of broad consent. So, broad consent basically means acquiring a consent for a large variety of research or medical practices. So, there are current debates going on the issue of broad consent, and a very popular and a very persuasive view in the US about is that if we acquire consent, it should be educatedly informed, and broad consent is not a very educatedly informed consent. Here, the author gives two very important examples. First of which being the banking of samples. So, as the evolution in science and technology, it has become more difficult to protect the rights of the nation, of the patients or subjects. So, for example, when samples are collected, for example, blood samples are collected from patients or subjects for future researches, there the consent is very roughly formulated because the use case of the samples are not yet determined. Now, here the question arises that how should we understand what constitutes an adequately informed consent in such a situation? Now, one way to solve this problem is making sure that the information, the personal and sensitive information of the subjects or patients are protected. However, implying merely the internal protection against such data is not sufficient, because generally this data is acquired by external institutions, for example, governmental organizations, etc. Therefore, the author says it must be made sure that the data collected is collected under valid consent. The next example which the author used is the example of the Havasupai Indians living in the Grand Canyon in America. Now, in this case, because a broad consent was acquired, a big problem arose in the 1990s. There was a research conducted where the tribe of the Havasupai tribe, the people of the tribe, they gave their DNA samples to researchers, which was aimed at actually finding out the reasons of high number or increasing number of type 2 diabetes amongst the tribe members. After the research was conducted, the blood samples were actually donated for additional researches concerning mental illnesses or geographical origin of the people, and about half a dozen of research articles were published in that context. However, the tribe members judged these research articles to be offensive and to be very offensive and insulting to them, because, for example, one of the articles they concluded that there is a lot of inbreeding in the tribe. Now, after being asked, one of the genealogist or the researcher in the original research, she said that there was a broad consent taken for a wide variety of genetic researches, and she defended her actions as ethically justified. Now, in the 1990s, the tribe, about 600 or more members of the tribe, signed on consent forms, which were very simply written, curated with the basic information of the research which is being conducted. Here, the problem was that English is the second language of the tribe members. So there was a chance where there was a chance where the consent form was misinterpreted by the tribals. Now, here, this case is a very simple and effective demonstration of how the problem with a broad consent. Now, one view on this case was that it is the responsibility of the researchers to make sure that the research subjects are being, the information about research is being effectively communicated to the research subjects and understood by it. This case also arises a question about how ignorance of the researchers can lead to exploitation of vulnerable tribes like the Havasupai Indians. Now, the last challenge posed by the author is the challenge of how should we alter the ways in which consent is regulated. Before starting with this problem, let us understand there is a very important differentiation which actually forms our view of bioethics. It is the differentiation between clinical researches and medical practices. So generally, clinical researches are termed risky, and medical practices are termed in the best and for the betterment of the patient and in their best interest. And due to the history of malpractice and unethical treatment of research subjects, it is assumed that research using human subjects is dangerous, and it is only very beneficial for the future generation rather than the person who is in the research. And consequently there have been questions about the need of how there is a greater need of consent forms in research rather than medical practice. But here there is a question which the author poses, that should this distinction be make any differences in the requirements of consent form and a very fully informed consent forms for medical research or a medical practice. Another question which is raised here, which is not solved, and it is a problem, that should there be a moral system for regulating consent forms or informed consent, or should there be a government system for regulating such consent? Thus, pertaining to all the above points, the research in this area is required and is very essential for developing a very thorough literature in bioethics and the practice. To conclude, I would just like to say that acquiring an adequately and fully informed consent is very important to protect the rights of the research subjects and the medical patients. And therefore, there should be further exploration in this field of bioethics so that these rights can be protected. Thank you and have a nice day.